Good afternoon from London to all attendees listening and watching from all parts of the world, and welcome to the first ILM webinar titled Traceability in the Leather Supply Chain. I would like to thank you all for tuning in, and we truly have a broad representation of the leather supply chain taking part today. My name is Martin Ricker, and I am Content Director of International Leather Maker and the SAL Report. Today's webinar is organised by International Leather Maker and is sponsored by leading global leather chemicals maker Stahl and France headquarters cutting equipment and software solutions provider Electra. I would just like to briefly run through the webinar programme. There will be 3 presentations. I will provide around a 15-minute general overview of what traceability is and why it is needed in the leather supply chain. I will also focus on the early part of the chain. I will then hand over control of the webinar to Mike Costello, Sustainability Director of Stahl, who will provide a company perspective on how a chemical company in the leather industry can support traceability, including the Reveal initiative. After Mike, we will listen to Steve Signorelli, Solution Consultant at Electra, who will present leather traceability within the cutting process. This should provide some specific information on technology that already exists today that can help to track cut parts into finished leather products. Once Steve has completed his presentation, we'll hand the webinar back to me, and you are invited to send me your questions for any of the 3 presenters, and we will do our best to answer them if time allows. There will be a brief Q&A session. I will then wrap up the webinar with some conclusions and challenges facing the leather supply chain and provide some information for further reading on this subject and other online resources. Before we begin, I just wanted to give you a very brief overview of who we are. ILM is an industry-leading multi-platform media business which was founded as recently as 2013, dedicated to the global leather industry, covering online, print, digital, social media, as well as events such as conferences and now webinars. Our core focus is on tanners, but we are regularly read by global industry professionals covering the whole leather supply chain. The SAL Report is an online raw materials pricing and trends platform which is updated daily from a network of sources from around the world. This year we have added a new section of what will become longer in-depth reports covering key topics affecting the leather industry. The first such report, Traceability in the Leather Supply Chain, is linked to the webinar today. Much more in-depth information on this subject can be found inside the report. So what is traceability? Traceability is the formal documentation of product history and its processes. The distinction between internal company traceability and supply chain traceability is marked, but they often lead into each other. Today we will focus on chain traceability. In the context of this webinar, there has been an identified need to increase the transparency and tracking of information about leather from the farm to the leather retailer and onto the consumer. So what are the drivers behind greater traceability? Price will always remain the highest driver for any consumer, and any consumer behaviour study will identify this. Once price is no longer an issue, consumers will be more mindful of the ethical, environmental and health implications of the products they consume. The need to be able to show where the products and their ingredients come from is continuously growing. According to studies from other industries, there are 7 main drivers towards traceability. Time does not allow us to talk in detail about each one, and further information can be found inside our recently published report. So what are some of the influences of supply chain traceability? The first one is animal welfare and husbandry. There is an increasing awareness among consumers around animal welfare and husbandry, and it is very important that brands and retailers sourcing leather ensure that hides and skins that are used to make their leather come from origins where internationally respected welfare standards are adhered. Animal welfare campaign groups and NGOs are continuously shining a light on this issue, and the tanning industry is generally supportive. Better animal welfare and husbandry standards equals better hides and skins, thus better leather as a general rule of thumb. It's in everyone's interest that animal welfare remains a priority. We'll briefly talk about some initiatives and practical problems in this area later in the webinar. The second point is ethical and transparent sourcing. Consumers also expect that the leather products they buy have been made safely and the production methods and people employed to produce these goods are treated fairly and in keeping with international norms. This includes safe working conditions, avoidance of slave and child labour, and the provision of adequate terms of employment and social benefits. Being able to source with known and compliant suppliers through the supply chain at each tier will also go some way to ensure that brand reputation is protected. The third element is counterfeiting. Counterfeiting has been discussed at many leather conferences over the years. Estimating the value of counterfeiting is difficult, as is this an illegal activity. However, a report published by Dakers claims that counterfeited goods make up 2.5% of all trade, and it is costing the global economy $250 billion a year. Others place the value closer to $500 billion. The figures Dakers quoted from an OECD report in 2015 stated that footwear and leather products occupied the first and third rankings respectively of goods seized by anti-counterfeiting organisations. The fourth area concerns exotic leathers. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, aims to protect endangered wildlife. 182 governments have signed up to this treaty and they are bound legally to obey the regulations. It also becomes very difficult for brands and retailers to convince their leather consumers of the authenticity of CITES compliant leathers if the history of the leather from the farm to the bag is not tracked and documented. The area of specific interest for brands and retailers is to ensure traceability information is in place and it can be validated forensically by the CITES management authorities. The fifth element is environmental and chemical transparency. I will let Michael Costello talk more about how the chemical industry is making itself more open and how companies such as Style are addressing this area. From an environmental standpoint, it is paramount that a brand or retailer has full confidence that its products are made with the absolute minimum impact on the environment. Global media attention is rightly given to issues such as deforestation and environmental pollution of the land, air and water systems. The tanning process involves the use of many different chemicals and significant quantities of water. However, new technologies aimed at reducing the environmental burden do exist today. Many tanners are now audited through industry protocols such as the Leather Working Group, ICEC in Italy, CSCB in Brazil and others. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the LWG and other bodies and associations working in this area. In fact, the ICEC, the Italian Quality Certification Institute for the leather sector, has references to raw material and finished leather traceability on its website, icec.it. So what are the benefits of greater traceability? There are several benefits for any business by establishing a fully traceable supply chain, including some which are financial. Here, I just outlined some of the benefits. As we've got a lot to cover in this webinar today, I'll move on, but they are fairly self-explanatory. Tracing from the farm to the finished leather product. For the next part of my presentation, I'm going to focus on the first three items mentioned in this slide, and I'll leave other presenters to touch upon the other areas where they have a greater knowledge and expertise than I do. From farm to slaughterhouse. The overwhelming majority of all leather produced today comes from a byproduct or co-product of the meat industry. Without the meat industry, we wouldn't have a leather industry, and it's important to point out that the leather is a natural and renewable material and does not come from fossil fuels. Having said that, it does come from animals, and as we mentioned earlier, it is important to source raw materials where good animal welfare and husbandry practices are proven to be in place. As a very general rule of thumb, any leather made from hides and skins produced in developed countries will have most likely been treated humanely throughout the animal's life and death. However, it would be very general and misleading comment to suggest that there is not good welfare practices and slaughtering taking place in developing countries. But it also would be naive for any brand or retailer not to check raw material sources with its leather suppliers with documentary evidence that supports hide and skin origins. It is also important to state that any brand or retailer looking to trace hides or skins back to the farmer, especially where large land masses and large farm animal populations are concerned, has a difficult task. In my mind, this is one of the largest, if not the largest challenge facing full traceability in the leather supply chain. Hopefully in the future, with the whole chain working more closely together with adequate resources, it may be possible to achieve a general system back to the farm, at least on an industrial scale. However, it should be recognised that the costs of scaling this up would have to be considered carefully. Best practice examples of traceability to the farm that exist today are based around specific types of animals, such as field calf or controlled cattle herds, such as organic cattle, where the numbers are relatively tiny compared with the daily global slaughter figures. Even the largest and most organised meat packers and abattoir groups are unable to trace back to the farm by individual currently. However, they do have records of the farms where the animals were sourced. Where traceability systems are in place, each animal is ear tagged and has its own electronic passport, giving details such as birth date, parentage, weight, farm origin, along with each animal's own personal ID number. This animal-specific information can then be passed on to the slaughterhouse, and it should be possible then to continue this on through the supply chain. Hot or freeze branding, tattooing, hair discoloration and microchipping are all other methods that can be adopted. However, animal welfare issues over hot branding already exist, and microchipping presents some food safety concerns in case any chips were to enter the food chain. Discoloration of the animal's hair by the more humane freeze branding may be an option that should be considered, at least up to the point that the hair is removed in the tanning process. Once the animals arrive at the slaughterhouse, most modern plants are already equipped with traceability systems geared around food safety, which is well advanced in this area. There are some plants where the hides and skins are stamped on site with a unique number, or where waterproof disposable tags are added and data logged. Information linked to the sex, weight, date, time, slaughterhouse location can be collected and linked to each hide stamp or tag number. I'll show some examples on the next slide. Most raw hides are either processed fresh or are then shipped in semi-tanned as wet blue or wet white, or completely processed to crust or finished by the tanner. Alternatively, many hides are salted directly at the abattoir or via a hide or skin trader and shipped around the world as a traded commodity. Currently, at this point, when many hides are regraded by weight and quality, and pallets are mixed and shipped, it makes tracing each hide very difficult. However, more traders and tanners are introducing some kind of stamping system with data collection, and this is very much the way forward in this area. There is also a greater move towards using more chilled fresh hides rather than salting. However, this is still in its infancy in most areas. As mentioned earlier, the Leather Working Group does mention traceability as part of its protocol in Section 4. I believe Mike Costello will touch upon this more in his presentation, so I will leave that over to him. Moving on to crust and finished leather, after the beam house and wet processes in the tannery, the leather is in the dried state. At this point, it is still possible to trace the hide stamp as long as the stamp was applied to each part of if the leather was cut into sides or other cut parts such as bellies and necks. However, now that the material is dry, it is now possible to add a sticker with a unique barcode or QR code, and additional data about the leather process, area, weight, as well as its previous history can now be tracked via a software system with data capture. This technology is now commonplace and many tanners have adopted it. So what's in the pipeline for the future? I've skimmed the surface of a complex supply chain in just a few minutes, But before I hand over to Mike Costello, I just want to briefly mention one particular new technology that's in the pipeline, DNA marking. US-based Applied DNA Sciences, ADNAS, and UK-based BLC Leather Technology Centre, together with 4 project partners, are investigating the use of DNA markers to trace materials through the leather supply chain. Work is still in its infancy, but the technology developed by ADNAS has been proven to be successful in other industries, such as including the cotton industry. The technology makes use of special markers that consist of DNA that are sourced from plant cells. The plant DNA is cut up using enzymes and then reassembled in an encrypted sequence that embeds the information about the product being marked. The marker is then applied to the products being tracked, and the DNA fragments remain attached to the product during its manufacturing and use cycles. The DNA is non-coding, i.e. cannot produce proteins, and it is not a gene, and it can survive most chemical processes. That's all from me for now in the first part of the webinar. I'm now going to hand over control of the webinar to Mike Costello, who will talk on the theme of today's webinar from Styles' perspective.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for that introduction, Martin. Indeed, my name is Michael Costello. I'm responsible for sustainability in Style, and I'd like to talk a little bit about traceability today from the perspective of a chemical company supplying into the leather chain, but also from a company that is really focused on promoting transparency throughout the supply chain. It's part of our corporate culture, and that's why on the surface traceability in leather may not be something that a chemical company would be involved in, but we believe it's very important from the transparency perspective. And first of all, if we look at some of the key market trends that are happening right now, we see that brands, luxury sports brands, clothing brands, are expanding their organizations with regard to sustainability. They're getting more people in, and it's getting to be a much more important part of their business. And as a result, transparency has emerged as a corporate goal for them, but also for many of us in the whole leather supply chain. And as a consequence of that, traceability is like a subset of transparency and a consequence of promoting full transparency. And one of the points that we also would like to make, and we make, is that traceability is about marking hides, but not just about marking raw hides. It's actually much more than that. It's about opening up all of the inputs into the process and revealing everything that's happening in that process, including, of course, the chemical side. But, of course, hide traceability is an important part of that, and it is part of the Leather Working Group audit protocol. Stahl, like most of the chemical suppliers and many others in the audience, perhaps, are members of the Leather Working Group. In fact, we're a member of the executive committee now, so we're very much part of this process. And there is a high traceability section in the audit protocol. And basically what it means is that the leather processors have to present documents that indicate where the slaughter occurred, and indeed they have to show a procedure that describes the manner in which traceability can be assured. So this means that any tanner who wants to get a LWG rating already has to have traceability as part of its daily life. So that's already in place for some time. So that's the hide. But how then could a chemical company like us promote transparency and traceability, even though we're not producing leather or handling leather ourselves? Well, as I mentioned, we have a corporate strategy that is to promote transparency. And we believe, and we've seen in this case, that it can actually trigger very positive activity in the supply chain, even though we may not always be directly linked to that activity. So what we did was we organized an event, which has turned into a process, but the event was called Reveal. It was a day where we got together many different stakeholders in the industry, but in particular we chose a very contained supply chain, in this case from Holland, the Dutch calf supply chain, to showcase that as a kind of a model for transparency and traceability, since it can be easily contained and illustrated in a series of presentations and visits. And in fact, that's what we did. We got input during the whole day with this group of people from several stakeholders, including ourselves from the chemical side. We had from the slaughterhouse side, Pali Group, Rumpet Tanneries, of course, from the tannery side, and then a company called SKV, which is a meat quality control company in Holland, very experienced in quality control and quality assurance. The Zero Discharge Foundation had an input, and Mr. Brugnoli from Spin 360 also. So at this event, we first discussed the different issues with chemical management, farming practices, quality control, leather processing, etc. And then we actually went out from the room and visited some of these places. We went to a farm, to a tanner, and we discussed and actually saw at first hand how these things were actually being done. You can see there's a photo of the first part of the day in the morning, where we had several presentations from the stakeholders. I think we're looking at the beginning of one from ZDHC there. And then after a few presentations, we went out into the field and we visited a farm where we were explained about how Dutch calf is managed, how the calves are separated, how they're handled, how they're treated, and really showing off the good practices that already exist in this particular farm and indeed in the whole Dutch supply chain. Again, a showcase, a model for how things could be everywhere, and really interesting visit for those of us, not so familiar with the farming industry. And then we moved on to the tannery, and we saw how those particular hides can be processed using chemicals, of course, that are compliant and environmentally sound, and how a beautiful piece of leather can actually be produced using good practices, lowering environmental footprint, and producing a quality product along the chain. So that was the event, the real event, and it was really, aside from a very enjoyable event, it triggered a lot of discussions, processes that have since been continued, and we hope will result in good practices around the industry in general. And this is really what we were trying to achieve at the event, triggering conversations and processes and actual real actions that can reduce, not just reduce environmental footprint, but improve traceability in this case. But of course, traceability is not just about stamping the hides, as we said. We believe that chemical compliancy is an important element of traceability. And what's happened in the last few years is quite dramatic in the chemical industry, because until a few years ago, the industry in general, not just for leather chemicals, but for chemicals in general, has been regulated by global systems, governmental systems like REACH, TSCA, and these are the law where you have to comply in order to produce and commercialize chemicals. But what's happened in recent years in our industry is that brands have got together, either individually or in groups, and they have implemented MRSL, so manufacturer restricted substance lists, which are being sent down through the supply chain. ZDHC, ChemIQ, Urcatex, BlueSign, Inditex. And these are usage bans. They're lists of chemical substances which are banned, and they're applied to identified substances that what we want to get out of the system by the year 2020, for example, or whatever the year is. So what this has resulted in, it's resulted in a shift of responsibility for the elimination of these substances to the chemical industry. That lies with us now to produce and offer portfolios to the market which are compliant. But it also implies an important disclosure of that compliance, and indeed the chemical content of those products is also required to disclose as a result of this opening up transparency of the supply chain in terms of chemicals used. One good example of this last point is the ZDHC Gateway process, which is a portal basically into which the chemical suppliers will soon start uploading their products and information about their products, including safety data sheets and other information about the products. And in that portal, it will be indicated the compliance level of those products to the ZDHC gateway, or indeed it could be to other compliance systems which are in the market. So again, a very good example of how the chemical industry is opening up and being more transparent, but also shows how, in terms of traceability, how anyone in the supply chain could look into this portal and check the chemicals that are being used at their suppliers or themselves, whether they're compliant, how compliant they are, whether they're not on the list, etc., etc. So we see that chemical compliancy is actually a very important element of that whole supply chain that we saw earlier for making leather. That's all I have for now. I'll be happy to take questions later, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you to Michael. I'm now going to pass the webinar over to our next presenter, Steve Signorelli of Lectra, who will present leather traceability within the cutting process.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Signorelli, and I am the UK manufacturing consultant for Lectra. I've been with Lectra now for some 27 years as an engineer, and I'm now the manufacturing consultant. Today I have the pleasure in showing you how Lectra systems can help with your leather parts traceability. Whilst this is not a new concept, up to now it's all been paper recording and rather difficult, if possible at all. The ability to trace a particular part is possible. It may not be as easy as you hope yet, but it is easier than you have now. So, to continue. Where does it all start? Well, in my humble opinion, it starts in two different places. This is a picture of a Versalis auto machine. It has two heads and one conveyor. Here you can see the barcode reader. This is for the operator. And here you can see the offload screen for part identification. In the initial stages, we see the labels on your left that are supplied with each hide, and on your right a model showing all the parts available. The model being all the parts including variations, and the variant being just the parts required for a particular area. For example, a model would contain all the parts for, say, a Trabant car, including every variation of that car. The variants would be the parts for, say, a left-hand drive center console or a right-hand drive business pack for their luxury Trabant. The hide label contains two useful identifiers, the size and the batch. These come from the manufacturer, and as you'll notice that they're both written as barcodes, so we can input them either as barcodes or we can manually input the data. This is where a work order is created. This is called leather order, and the variants to be cut are chosen. And here we can see three variants in an order. So, following the batch and the parts, here's where the fun really starts. The combining of the parts, the hides and the cutting, the offload identification and the leather reporting. But more on these last two later. So now the start of the tracing can begin. Here in Supervisor, we can select the order, which will also define the colour, and to the right of the screen, just underneath the colour, we can input the supplier, the hide area, which can also come from the barcode, and finally the batch number. The hide is then scanned and given a unique name based on the date and time of scanning to the second, and it is then nested. This is where the next part of the process takes place. Once the hide is scanned, the parts are placed on the hides. This is done in order of the arrival of the hides. And each hide is given an individual name. Like I said before, this is based on the machine name, date and time of scanning. And then the hide, when shown in this configuration, this particular one is a completed work order. The hide name shown relates to the one here in the yellow box. From here, the hide is sent to be cut and the parts retrieved using software called OFFLOAD. Here are a few snaps of various offload screens. These show how the parts laid have different colours, which are defined by the different variants, each on a separate line on the work order. Here are the part names, and here are the variant colours. Let's look closer for a moment at one of these hides with multiple parts on it. Here with the red line, you can see the part identified on the hide. Now if you click on a part, it shows you a name and which variant it belongs to, shown here with blue lines. I was thinking you'd all be getting bored now with all the red all the time. Now if you look at the top, the next green line shows the name of the work order. In this case it's A_GN and so on. This would refer you to your order number for that particular car set, sofa, individually made leather trousers and so on. In this case there are 3 orders combined to increase the yield on the hide. And finally, here's the hide name. And as you can see, it is very individual, down to the second. From here, the leather nesting software, we can request a printout of the individual hides, showing the parts in relation to the quality zones both on the hide and the parts. From the leather offload, we can get a slightly different printout. Here we see the work order name, the hide name, and all the parts used with the part names and the parts. Every time a job is cut, a special cut file is updated. Within Lectra we call this a TRV file. This data can be read using the Lectra Leather Reporting software. Leather Reporting is a very, very powerful tool when used correctly. So at present, you can trace the part back to the hide it was cut on. The main exception being if you have multiples of the same part within the same variant, as they may well be scattered throughout the order, and in that case throughout the hides. For example, if you're cutting 100 arms in one order and nothing else, you'll be able to tell which hides were used for the order and which batches those hides came from, but not which part was cut on which hide within that order. And at the moment, operators have to write down batch numbers on the paper that comes with it. Using the Lectra Leather Reporting software, you can, amongst other things, view your leather usage by colour, your yield by colour, and so on. For this presentation, all we are interested in seeing is the TRV file as a text summary, which gives us this. This is a filtered document, and I've blanked out certain fields as this is actually a live document. And as you can see, there are quite a few fields here, and I've already removed quite a few fields beforehand. The ones we are interested in are the hide name, the work order name or number defining the original order, the variant name, so we can check that we are actually using the correct variant, and finally the batch identifier. Now with this final piece of information, you can find which batch file your part was cut in. But don't forget, as with life, there are provisos. So, how does it all come together? We started with the hide label scanned in. We created the order with the variants. The hide was nested and cut. You could choose to print out the hide picture showing the quality zones only, or we can print out directly from OFFLOAD software, which gives us the part number and the hide number. And finally, all this information can be retrieved using the Leather Reporting software. This is where you have the hide number, work order, and everything else, including the variant, displayed, and of course the batch number, allowing you to find and relate everything back. So you can actually relate the part to the hide, to the work order, and finally to the colour batch. So how can this help you? Let's look at a scenario. A customer has bought an £85,000 car like a BMW X5 top of the range, and the leather of the seat starts to stretch beyond what is normally allowed or expected after a very short period of time. We need to know what went wrong. So the tracing begins. The car manufacturer looks at the VIN for the car, works out when it was built. From this they can tell the order that was placed for the leather and with whom it was placed. They contact their Tier 1 supplier who cut and built the parts. Using the processes we've just seen, the Tier 1 supplier can look up the order number, create the Excel sheet from the TRV using leather reporting, look for the order, date, and you can tell what the batch number of the hide was. And if there was more than one batch, you can look at the offload print to see the exact hide number, then revisit leather reporting to see the batch number again and the supplier. You can also look at leather nest printout or within the leather nest screen and see if the parts were placed in a bad area, for example, in the belly of the hide, which is the part with the most stretch. At this point, the investigation can go either one of two ways. Back to the leather supplier, who can identify the tannery, and who in turn, from the batch number, should be able to identify the chemicals used and so on, to finally identify the problem. Now, I'll be honest here, I've no real knowledge of the processes within a tannery. However, this is how I would imagine them to be, knowing just how strict they are. Or the other option, internally, find out who marked up the hide and who was the supervisor. And from there on the cutter you can see why the parts were laid in a certain area. Were they laid in the correct quality zones, or was there an override? Within scenario 2 on a leather sofa, it's a very, very similar process. So as you can now see, this method of tracing is far easier than what people have been doing up to now, which is manually writing everything down. And should you fail to fill in one part, the whole system falls down.
Thank you very much, Steve. Just wanted to sort of, we looked at the questions, and unfortunately there hasn't been any questions for the panelists today, apart from one. Unfortunately, we can't really answer that one, so maybe we can come back to the questioner after the event. So I just wanted to sort of wrap up the presentation now with my conclusions. Traceability in the leather supply chain is improving, but it is patchy and still disjointed in many areas. It's still difficult to trace rawhides and skins on a large scale in a global supply chain. However, we believe that there are associations and organisations in the industry working towards this. In the pipeline, there are new technologies such as DNA marking, which will be trialled and hopefully will come to fruition in the future. Also, it's worth noting that the whole leather supply chain is now working more closely than ever before to improve transparency and traceability. And one thing I would like to mention that's quite an important point is that brands, retailers and consumers must understand if they want traceability in the leather industry, it has a financial cost. There's one that they must also invest in to ensure of a transparent supply chain. And finally, perhaps the take home of today is businesses that adopt a transparent and traceable supply chain are best positioned to understand where their products come from and how they were made. Following the webinar, we have included an online survey for you to complete, so please give us your feedback. If you want to know more about traceability in the leather supply chain, we have published an in-depth report on the subject, which can be purchased and downloaded from the SAO report website. For further information about traceability or related information can be found on ILM platforms or any of the websites mentioned here. Finally, it just remains for me to thank our other presenters this afternoon and thank you for attending the Traceability in the Leather Supply Chain webinar. I hope that you took away some interesting and valuable information. Goodbye.